Welcome, data enthusiasts. My name is Joseph, co-founder of Zuma Recruitment, the consultancy focused 100% on data professionals in and around the Berlin region. But today, this is our podcast, Data for Good, connecting you with all things data. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined once again by Max Weber. Max is now Head of People and Workplace Operations at Mister Spex. Mister Spex being the leading omnichannel optician in Europe, based in Berlin. Max, welcome back. How's it going today?
Thank you for having me, Joseph. I'm good. Especially today, it's going really well. Another sunny day in Berlin, so having a good time.
Yeah, super. Great signs of spring. And we're seeing similar signs of spring in the business ecosystem as well. So
let's hope for it. And I think we're going to touch upon these topics today at least a little bit. So, yeah.
Super. Okay. I recall, and for others to recall, our last conversation was more broadly about people analytics, you being an expert in the people analytics field. And today, I understand that you'd like to go into a specific area, talking about analytics for headcount planning. So a topic for any business with plans of growing their team. Why has this specific topic become relevant for you, Max?
Yes. I mean, analytics for headcount planning, as you said, it's relevant for growing companies, but similarly, it's very important for shrinking companies or companies who might be, let's say, confronted with the multi-crises that we're seeing all around the world, and especially also in the business ecosystem at the moment. And as such, well, analytics in headcount planning basically is putting a more analytical approach to everything that relates to the biggest cost factor that any business will have, which is usually staff. You'll be in a tough position to find a company that has its largest part of its expenses in HR cost. And as such, of course, especially when you're confronted with maybe the profit side or at least the growth side of your business being challenged by just how the market is evolving, especially when you're a retailer like Mister Spex, but also for any, let's say, B2B companies. You'll be confronted with a lot of cost-cutting requirements at the moment. And in order to facilitate that, you have to have a very good understanding of how your headcount and thus your personnel cost is going to evolve in the future.
It's easy and obvious to go right to the end result. A team either grows or it doesn't grow. But could you give me some of the more intrinsic or detailed impacts on a business as a result of the actual analytics at the time?
Yeah. So when you're usually planning your headcount, I think in a lot of companies, at least from what I've seen, you would be starting with like a bottom-up approach. You would actually think, well, which kind of projects do I want to facilitate in the future? Where do I see growth opportunities for my business? And by following that approach, you are somewhat analytical because you're making assumptions about the future, what projects you're going to do, and then how you would like to staff them. And then you roll all of these different projects and teams and departments up, and you get to basically your headcount plan or your target, which you would like to achieve in order to facilitate the projects that you assume to be aiding your financial result in the end of the day. And the moment that you are following this bottom-up first approach and not following an approach where actually you're going in and you're making only assumptions about how much money you will be able to spend in the future, and then you would like to identify how your current cost structure is going to align with the profit that your company is going to make in the future. And in order to identify how your cost side is actually going to evolve, you will have a lot of different factors suddenly coming into play. Of course, if you're then making assumptions top down, you would, so also about the cost growing, then you would say, well, I hope it stays steady, or I hope I can maybe grow it only a little bit, but still fulfill all the projects. But usually that's not how it pans out, right? You can try to then steer the company to align the, let's say, the actual development of your headcount with the plan and thus your profitability targets. But in this situation, when you're only making a top-down assumption about how your team is going to evolve, you're making one first step to running into a lot of mistakes. Because what if you're actually going above the threshold? Now you have to react immediately in order to adjust the cost and the profit side to one another, which means, well, maybe you have to do a carve out in your team and just let go of a number of workers. And that's something that we're currently seeing all across the industries. We see it in large technology firms with a long history like SAP, but you would also see it in smaller startups or e-commerce brands that you would usually find in a market like Berlin. And in order to avoid these, let's say, harsh measures in trying to align your cost side to your profitability, you will always stir up an organization. You will create situations where maybe also people are leaving whom you'd actually like to keep. And you will distract people from maybe fulfilling on projects. You will distract them from doing their day-to-day job in the way that they would be used to. So what you would like to do is have a more long-term outlook onto the, let's say, the cost side or the number of people that you have in your business, factoring in, on the one hand, just another set of top-down KPIs, something like turnover, heavily influencing your headcount, but then also things like required skill, required roles, if you want to go into less detail, but also maybe even spans and layers. So the relationship between managers and their teams and how large a team is. And as soon as you start factoring in all of these additional components that are giving you information about your headcount, suddenly this becomes like a complex model, which you can use in order to steer your business with a, let's say, more long-term vision. You'll be in a situation where, where you aren't just reacting to a number changing, and then you make, like, you're undertaking certain measures and stirring up your business, but instead you're trying to factor in as many variables that are influencing how your team is performing over a longer period of time. And then you can really go into smaller pockets of where you can maybe change the team here and there to improve the cost side, maybe where you can do a small carve out, not just let's say a big initiative that you would do once.
Okay. Going high level for a moment, you mentioned the variables and the pockets, and then you mentioned formulating a complex model. What data points are we typically analyzing, be it historical trends or future growth?
So you can start very top down and non-granular, and you will already know something, right? You could just take your current headcount and look at the same data points, considering future positions that you have, and then you get some sort of semblance of what it might look like in the future. But if you're doing that, then you're forgetting that there are people who might have already quit quietly and will be quitting in the future. And you're usually underestimating the turnover that you would have in your organization. So what you would like to do is factor in additional data points, for example, for a specific job role or for a specific department, for a specific org hierarchy. There's a, let's say, higher or lower turnover, which you have to then factor in the future development of this team's headcount. Then, of course, I've already mentioned, you might have certain requirements to have a certain number of roles. I know that I definitely need 50 engineers. Well, then You could also factor this in, that your team of engineers, no matter what the turnover is always going to be 50. Then going even deeper than that, you could also look into skills that your team has. So if you're maybe being a bit more concrete and you don't say, I need 50 engineers, but I need 50 people who can do software engineering. That might be something different, right? And then you can even go one layer deeper and set this as the bar. Also, you will have, of course, other factors that might be externally driven. So how is the recruitment market at the moment? That's probably a topic very dear to you. And if I have a tough market, then I will maybe have a longer lapse between somebody vacates a position and I can refill the position. And that again is a data point that I have to consider in order to forecast my turnover. Now, you see, with increasing data points, you will have a larger number of just factors that you have to pull in order to come up with a model that predicts the future.
Must be challenging for team leaders and founders and business leaders not to use their intuition in those moments. This is how it's always been. We predict the business is going to make X amount of revenue, so this is what we can do, and this is what a team will look like. It must be quite difficult.
So, I mean, earlier you asked, do you consider historical data? And you don't do so much, right? Because if you do, it's like the story about the goose that's very happy all the time from September through mid-December. And then mid-December, the goose, when it's really fat and it had a very amazing few months where it was fed a lot, suddenly realizes, oh, the future is not going to be the same way that the past was. And that also applies to my planning. So the way that many businesses have performed in the past, let's say 3, 4, 5 years, especially e-commerce with COVID driving a lot of traffic to like online retailers, online platforms, that's changing now, and it's changing significantly. The businesses are still growing, but nowhere near as much. And also, of course, you have like corporate finance considerations that are just making it harder for companies to raise money to actually invest in their growth. And these are just factors that are changing. So taking my assumptions from the past and now trying to template them on my assumptions about the future, that's going to be incorrect. However, as you said, well, do people actually use their intuition, or can they use their intuition? And that's highly encouraged. So of course you should use your intuition. And when, for example, you are giving an indicator how many months you would assume a position would be empty between somebody vacates and somebody's refilling, well, that's something that can only be based on intuition. That's just a fiction, right?
Okay. So you would advise leaders to stay close to their prior knowledge and intuition of the market and
more so than an intuition, more so the intuition about the future than maybe some past experiences. Because filling a team lead software engineering maybe 3 years ago or 2 years ago was a completely different undertaking than it is now, right? Talent is becoming more and more scarce while companies are growing still and want to fill practically infinite amount of positions. You do have changes. So now when you're making assumptions about the future, considering the past in many events is not the great idea when all of the parameters based upon which you've made your assumptions in the past have changed over the last few months.
Not just historical, but current times. And I don't want to politicize this topic, but we mentioned e-commerce, we mentioned the tech world, we mentioned the last few years. And of course, this topic is about analytics for headcount planning. What we've seen across big tech globally is a great miscalculation of headcount planning. What would you put that down to?
From my experience, as I said earlier, a lot of companies make up their headcount plan based on purely bottom-up considerations. I want to achieve ABC, that's why I need XYZ. And then with that assumption, you're just building up more and more desire in your organization to actually recruit for people, because more people means more success, because more success is usually driven by more successful projects. And that's the miscalculation. In fact, when you are running a business, doing everything bottom up is going to maneuver you into these kinds of situations where you just have an organization that's basically uncontrollable and just rolling in its own ways. What you should rather do is start with the top-down target. This is how much I want to afford, maybe a percentage of how much your company is going to be profitable, or how much revenue there is going to be. And then from there, you can break it down into these, let's say, individual measures, which can result in maybe a small carve out in team ABC, or on the contrary, creating positions in team ABC. But the moment you put the creating positions first, you're creating a snowball effect where everything's just growing and growing and growing. And with every like 5 people you hire, you need a manager on top. And suddenly you're creating these exponential growth situations where you end up with hundreds of thousands of engineers, depending on the company, and you don't even have the clients to actually fulfill this. So having a good, let's say, a reasonable outlook as to how your business is going to perform in terms of just projects, clients, customers, orders coming in, and then from there saying, okay, this is how much staff I can afford, would be the smarter way. And then once you have this top-down target, that's when you can start actually planning the measures, and not vice versa.
I wanted to ask you if there's what would be a step-by-step plan that a leader could use to analyze and then plan their headcount. But I also think that the motivations and needs of departments vary greatly. Finance department, HR department, sales department, manufacturing, they're all going to have very different, their headcount planning is going to be very different based on a number of varietals, or correct me if I'm wrong, is there a step-by-step plan that any leader of those departments can follow?
So the good thing is, in principle, it works the same for everybody, even though they might need different profiles. They might have more or less flexibility in refilling certain positions or reallocating. Basically, if you're going into this, let's say, planning cycle, then it's got 2 components. I said earlier, you've got the planning component, and then you've got the measure. And the problem always occurs when you're first planning the measures and then planning the plan or the outcome, the financial target. So what you would like to do is, first, you have a top-down approach. You set a certain target based on like your economic outlook. This is how much we can afford. Then you run your forecast, and you don't just run a forecast of existing people linear, but you actually run your forecast based on all these assumptions mentioned earlier. So which skills do I need? Which teams are going to be constant? Which terminations can we already assume, even though they aren't known, etc., etc. And then suddenly, between the target line and the organization that I have, a certain delta opens up, because I will have a certain level of headcount, let's say 20%. So 20% of my existing cost is going to go out naturally. And suddenly I have a 20% gap between my target and where I currently sit. And this is my, let's say, my wiggle room in order to plan additional positions, or frankly, if you're still above, then also to very carefully select the teams where you maybe wouldn't refill immediately or wouldn't refill at all.
So that's the planning side.
That's the planning side. Then you come to the measures, and the measures then, is what's taking place on a continuous level. The planning you would do maybe annually, quarterly, and you would adjust your assumptions about the future, but in principle, this is basically like a one-time activity. It's non-linear. Whereas the linear approach is I conduct my measures. So basically every day I can look at my forecast and see how it's performing versus my target. And this opens up the wiggle room, as I said. And now how do I fill the wiggle room? Well, exactly via the measures being which positions do I need? Do I have a certain need in team ABC that they need a specific engineer, a specific data expert, maybe a HR person, whatnot? Then if it fits in the budget, and let's say the HR committee approves it, then here I've got one very concrete measure to meet my target. Whereas on the other hand, you could also, and that's just how it is, have situations where you would have to carefully plan exits of existing workers, or situations where you do not refill. So the actual requisitions that you're putting in order to bring in people, this is the moment when you're then enacting the plan, where you're either getting closer or further away from a specific line that you've set out at the beginning of the year.
Excellent, excellent. I've taken note throughout, particularly around planning, non-linear. It can be annual, quarterly, or even half year. Top down, targeting, create your forecasts. Then with that, measurements daily and how they are performing against your targets. And then consider your measures, as in what are the needs versus factors like budget, and then action.
Exactly. And it might sound, let's say, very generic and basic and like something you would assume immediately, but this is exactly the opposite of the behavior that has led us to situations where companies are getting rid of a lot of people at the moment, right? Because first they were assuming, well, I need 50 engineers, and then later on they planned how much profit they have to make in order to satisfy 50 engineers. And they didn't do it the other way around. And that's usually the problem that occurs before you have the problem of having to, let go of a lot of people.
Interesting. Thanks for that perspective there. Along with this step-by-step plan, what things should leaders be mindful of? You mentioned the word be careful earlier. What should they be careful and mindful of in this plan?
Mm-hmm. So, as said earlier, the thing to be most careful about is not putting the measures first, but putting the targets first. You first set out the target, and only then you think about measures. That's one of the big fallacies you would usually run into, is that first you think, well, how much can I achieve? I have so many great ideas. Now let's go and hire a lot of people to fulfill these ideas, because I have the assumption that these ideas are going to be good for the business. That's usually not the case. So there's a lot of great ideas out there, but only maybe a handful of them is actually going to make your business perform better in like economic terms. So that's the first fallacy. Then secondly, especially in these, let's say, more dynamic economic situations as we're in at the moment, you will often find, let's say, erratic management. So some KPI looks bad, I have to let go of a lot of people. That's some of the reactions that you would be seeing at the moment. In order to just get away from these, let's say, harsh and erratic measures, well, you have to be aware that there is going to be natural movement in your headcount in the future. And so long as you're slowing down hiring, which in many companies doesn't even take place, even though they're letting go of so many people, you can actually create this aforementioned wiggle room, where then suddenly you get the option to refill, maybe even with a role that's way more suitable as the business evolves. So being too quick in, let's say, also setting up a mutual agreement, investing a lot in a severance payment, this will also harm your business to a degree. You can always expect that a certain degree of turnover is going to take place everywhere, especially in a market as it is right now, where there's a lot of competition for talent, even though so many companies are doing carve-outs.
Yeah, we've noticed. It's somewhat contradictory in many businesses. But yeah, not to go into that for now. Your work as a people analytics leader plays right into these topics, probably on a daily or at least regularly. I wonder how transferable they are to other departments and the analyses that they must perform.
I suppose the concept remains the same, but obviously you're then dealing with different things that you're measuring, right? So if you transferred it to marketing, then suddenly the people are maybe not the biggest factor in the success of your marketing team, but it might be the marketing budget. So basically the effort you invest. Whereas for the company as a whole, the effort they invest is largely driven by the HR, the personnel cost. For a marketing department, usually just the budget that you have to invest in channels is going to be the largest cost factor for this isolated group, and a good representation of the effort you put in order to achieve ABC. And here again, you could have the exact same fallacy where, first of all, you're planning all these amazing campaigns that you have in your mind and how you would like to use TikTok and Instagram and this and that in order to reach your customers and achieve fantastic results. But you haven't considered what the target is first. So if you're first going in, setting a top-down target, I want to reach 1 million new customers throughout the full year, then suddenly I can have a lot more measured approach how I actually want to allocate my marketing budget. And I can then factor in a lot more components about my forecasted marketing spend and thereby forecasted marketing success. So I could factor in the returning customer rate, I could factor in the cost per new customer, etc. And suddenly I will be able to figure out how can I reach these 1 million new customers in the most cost efficient way. Or maybe I'm already overachieving on returning customers. So I don't even have to reach as many new customers. By putting the target first, I'm then not trapped with a lot of new activities, projects, campaigns that down the line will cost me a lot of money, but might not even be appropriate to achieve the target that I set. And I might be overspending or underspending, frankly.
So it's entirely relatable. And the overwhelming message is target first, then measures should follow. Exactly. And also, I'd go back to the idea of not just being data-driven, but using your intuition. A lot of focus is given on everything being precise and measured, and results coming from these measurements. And we should not take for granted the power of this planning. Often comes from our experience in the field. As we bring the conversation to a close, just given time, I wonder where leaders in the analytics field, particularly in Berlin, where they can further research and execute on these topics that you've shared with us today.
I'm glad you asked this, because I researched this just before the call again. Because honestly, I really forgot the name of the one author I read, but now I know it. It's Thomas Sati. He's got a book on analytical planning. It's basically founded in system theory. I can highly recommend it. If you've read Luhmann before, this is going to be especially interesting for you. Basically explains in a top-down approach how from the system the organization works, you can then really move into planning measures, but also setting targets and seeing how the measures work against the targets in an economic organization. And then if that's a bit too robust for you, I would like to recommend David Green's Digital HR Leaders podcast, probably something that everyone's heard of, but they have an episode on workforce planning, which is very informative and also gives you more detail as to what's really going into a comprehensive workforce planning process, more detail than I can provide in 25 minutes.
Max, that's fantastic. Tackling it from two different, tackling the research and execution from two different angles. I will put those references as links in the comments section when we post the podcast. So yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. And thanks very much for sharing your insights today, the power of your experience and also the power of your analytical understanding.
Thank you so much for having me, Joseph. It was a pleasure once again. Happy to be here. Happy to share some of my experiences. I'm not quite sure it's knowledge. It's a lot of intuition, as you would like to call it at the moment, I suppose. But let's see how it pans out. We're only at the beginning of the year, so at the end of the year, we will know if that actually works.
Have faith in your intuition. Great, awesome, Max. And I think we'll be talking again at some point about another area of people analytics, whether it be to help our team or to help the wider Berlin community. So I'll sign off. Thanks. And yeah, farewell for now.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.